So Exodus 34 is where this whole story happens, and I'm not going to read the whole chapter because then we may as well read the whole book, and it's actually worth reading. It's not hard reading, and it's a pretty good story. But toward the beginning of the chapter, we find that the Lord has descended in the cloud and is standing with Moses and proclaiming the name, and in a Hebrew Bible there would be a Hebrew word here. I'll explain that in a minute. The Lord passed before Moses and proclaimed, "The Lord, the Lord." This is not an accurate translation. That word is in capital letters in the Bible because there's no translation for that. Some Bibles use Yahweh. I'll tell you why in a minute. A God merciful and gracious, slow to anger. Interesting how God is talking about God's own self in the third person. And abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That word is Hesed. Keeping Hesed to the 1,000th generation. Forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation, which sounds just terrible, but we're going to have a little conversation about that. And then, toward the end of that chapter, Moses came down from Mount Sinai. And as he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant, now this is his second set of tablets, because earlier he got a first set of tablets and he got down to the bottom of the mountain and he was so distressed by what was going on with the people and by what God had told him that he threw them on the ground in a temper tantrum. So we have to imagine that as he's going back up the mountain, he gets to look at the results of his last temper tantrum. And he comes down, and Moses didn't know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. There's that phrase, the skin of his face shone, which apparently is the exact same word in Hebrew as horns. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned, and Moses spoke with them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near, and he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with the people, he put a veil on his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what had been commanded, the Israelites would see the face of Moses, that the skin of his face was shining. And then Moses would put the veil on his face again until he went in to speak with him. And elsewhere we learn that the reason he put the veil on is because you couldn't stand to look at his face for very long. What an intriguing way of describing an encounter with God and what follows after encounter of God. So it's a really beautiful telling of a heart-rending and heart-opening story. It's an origin story. It's our origin story. It's an origin story shared by 3 faiths. And I just can't get away from the image of that first set of tablets being broken and littered wherever they are, and Moses has to walk past them to go up and get another batch. So poignant, so vivid. These wonderful tablets are referred to as testimony in Exodus 32. This is the testimony, the witness of God. And they're written in God's own handwriting. Moses isn't listening and carving them. God is writing it on the stone for Moses. Words are being used as a tool to convey the inexpressible. Words are being used. The voice words that Moses hears and the written words that Moses carries are being used to express the inexpressible. What a spiritual wonder. And Moses, too, lying shattered and broken before the Lord. The fragile dream he fought to keep alive, God's self leading them into the promised land. He falls to pieces when he hears in Exodus 33 that God says, I'm not going up to the promised land with you. Turns out later, Moses doesn't even go into the promised land. Now, there's something to know about this up and down Sinai thing. By the 7th chapter of Exodus, and we're in 29 here, by the 7th chapter of Exodus, Moses, who is over 80, okay, we got some of y'all here, has been up and down Sinai 9 times. Here's a picture of Sinai. 9 times. I'm not 80 yet, but I can tell you, climbing up that is a misery, and if my knees are any indication, coming back down is worse. 9 times. Apparently, God gave Moses some kind of supernatural, cartilage thing to get up and down 9 times. And so we don't ever hear Moses complaining about his knees or complaining about the climb. But Moses is by nature a complainer. He complains about the plagues in Egypt. He complains about how he's not a good talker, so he needs Aaron to help him. He complains about being in the desert. The people complain to him about being in the desert. The people complain about the manna. Apparently there is no food good enough for us that we want it every day. So I don't know, even if manna is a homemade brownie, apparently you don't want that every single day for 40 years. And Moses gets complained at and complained at and complained at, and he does the most natural thing. He goes and complains to God and complains and complains. And who can blame him? Because if you cannot take your griefs and sorrows and aggravations to God, where are you going to take it? And the response he gets from God is not, thank God, buck up, pal. That is not what God says. The one who spoke the universe into existence, who parted the Red Sea, who was accompanied by terrifying lightning as well as the soft whisper of a voice, comes to Moses in his real form. He speaks tenderly to Moses. And according to Scripture, the story picks him up and hides him in the cleft of a rock. And then puts God's hand over Moses while God passes by. And takes the hand away just long enough for Moses to get a glimpse of God's back. God is protecting his beloved child, his fragile friend, from the thing he cannot stand. But he is giving him as much of the presence of God as he can possibly tolerate. At last, God removes his hand and allows Moses a glimpse. And for the only time in Scripture, this is the only time in Scripture, we hear the word that is sometimes called the name of God from God's own lips. The Lord speaks the personal, unspeakable name twice. One time right after another, in case you didn't get it the first time. And this is what it looks like in Hebrew. This is called the Tetragrammaton, and what that means is 4 letters. Yod He Vav He, which many times is translated alliterally, according to the way it sounds. Not literally, but alliteratively as Yahweh. Yahweh. But Yahweh, as near as we can tell, is Hebrew for, hey, God. And some sources, particularly throughout Judaism's millennia, have suggested that this is not so much the name of God as something untranslatable because we can't understand it. Hesed, an inexpressible word for an inexpressible nature of God, whose very name is inexpressible. It's not hard to see how an encounter with this God would leave something shining from a person's face. The Bible calls it glory. Glory. That the glory of the Lord is shining from Moses' face, not on him, but from him. As in, the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. For those of you who like Messiah stuff at Christmas, glory indeed. The one who has spoken the universe into being, who molded planets, moons with his hand, now uses that same hand to cover his fragile friend and still give him glory. I am God's fragile friend. You are God's fragile friend. And then we hear that part about not cleansing the guilty. Not cleansing the guilty. And I want you to hear what that really means. Because here is where God is laying out God's defining characteristics. Hesed, compassion, grace, mercy, forgiveness, steadfastness, kindness, love. Loving kindness is the usual translation for Hesed, but Hesed appears 240 times, and that is a completely inadequate translation. And God makes clear that wrongdoing will eventually be righted, but not by punishment, by cleansing. The damage wrought by those who are unjust, cruel, willful, or just plain ignorant or damaged. People are damaged and they do things that are selfish and cruel. We are damaged when we are selfish and cruel. And there are consequences for our behavior. The consequences of free will is not the punishment of God. God is a God of justice, not a God of punishment. And if you grew up in a Sunday school of a certain generation, you were probably told that the Old Testament is the angry, punishing God, and the New Testament is the God of grace. That is not so. It is the same God throughout. And it's not punishment. God makes covenant with us. We break covenant because, humans. What are you going to do? Humans. And God allows what feels like punishment, but is simply the consequences of a world where we are free. And then God steps in to restore us to health and wholeness. What is wrongdoing? Why doesn't God punish wrongdoing? That seems like justice. Humans have a real deep-seated sense of what is justice. This is the argument we often have when we talk about the death penalty. Deep inside our lizard brain is this sense that if someone does a bad thing, then the world is out of balance and a bad thing has to happen to them to balance it. This is natural for us to feel this, which is why we quarrel about things like death penalties and jail sentences. There's no easy answer to that. People are damaged. And sometimes it is possible to make it right. There are choices for our behavior, and there are consequences. And very often, the consequences of our behavior feel like punishment, but they're just consequences. But, our scripture says, where there has been damage done, God will undo it. Where there is hurt, God will heal it. Where there is evil, God will cleanse it. So when we say God makes it right, God doesn't make it right the way we tend to want things to be right, which is either nothing bad should ever happen to anybody ever, or anytime anything bad happens to anybody anywhere, something bad should happen to balance the world out. None of that is what we see in Scripture. Where there is damage, God will undo it, usually through healing of some kind. Where there is hurt, God will heal it. Where there is evil, God will cleanse it. This encounter of Moses's, the encounter, reveals God's infinite compassion and mercy. That's what justice looks like. So what do we say about this encounter story of Moses's? Well, what is your story of your encounter with the glory of God? I believe most of us are having frequent encounters with the glory of God, but we miss them because we're not always paying attention. And perhaps you have one or two or a half a dozen times in your life when you just stood still and you knew that the glory of God was shining on you. You know, this is not just a story about Moses bringing the law down from the mountain. We can understand the ethical significance of that without any trouble. It's not even about Moses' special stature before God, because we can understand that. But this glory thing, it's really strange. For one thing, Moses doesn't even know. I guess they didn't have mirrors. Moses does not know that something is shining from his face. From time to time, I realize I do not know what my face is showing until someone takes a picture and I think, oh, that's an unfortunate expression. Queen Elizabeth used to say she had an unfortunate resting expression. Perhaps you know the less church clean version of that. The glory that shines apparently is coming through Moses because of his role in this story, not because of his own holiness or his own specialness. He was chosen for a job. He's doing his job. He's grumping about it as he goes along, but he's doing it, and the glory shines through. And now he's going to take his glorious looking self down and hand over to these people God's own handwriting and tell them what to do. How does God shine? What does it look like for God to shine? What do we make of this brightness that the Bible talks about? Well, maybe this brightness, which is so bright that Moses needs a veil most of the time so it doesn't damage the people. They couldn't stand to look at it. He's only exposing this. So he's just bright all the time. I don't know. It feels like a bad sunburn to me. But whatever is happening seems to have something in common with, this is the picture I chose, for the glory of the Lord shone upon the shepherds in the field at that Christmas. The glory of the Lord shone upon them. And when I went looking for a picture, I had to page through a bunch of things, but it was on the computer. Most of the images had angel-y looking beings up there. Not yet. It's all right. Anyway, go ahead and leave it up. Go back. Okay, for those of you who have an objection to organized religion, you don't like organized religion, you found your home. Not you. It's not you. We know it's not him. We know it's me. Okay, this is the one that is the Transfiguration. This is a really beautiful, famous painting by someone whose name I've forgotten. And again, the glory is kind of coming through Jesus. You can see that it's problematic because the guy who's leaning in the pink there on the right, he's kind of protecting his eyes from whatever it is that's shining. In his book, Michael Card writes, "This glory silences our religious chatter and renders us blinking and confused in its light. This glory brings us near to the disturbing events of Easter morning, where the disciples are both baffled and joyful, and even terrified to face the risen Lord, whose glory dispels even the gloom of death." Vincent van Gogh painted any number of ordinary things. A vase of sunflowers, a yellow chair, a collection of sailboats out on the water. And among his compositions is this: And it will not surprise you to know that the title for this is Old Work Boots. Why would an artist choose that? At first glance, it's so ordinary. It certainly is not glorious. There's nothing glorious about those old boots, except if you look at that, keep looking at that. The boots are illuminated from a light source that the painting doesn't give us a chance to understand. Most of the time, if you look at a painting, you can tell where the light source is coming from. Same as you can tell that my light source is coming from here because, it makes shadows this way and that way. You can't tell. In fact, there's a sense that the light source is coming from within the boots and shining out. They are illumined from beyond, and they describe a life not just of labor and toil, but of great human dignity, even beauty. The boots are glorious. It is their peculiar splendor that reflects humanity who labored so long in their use. These boots cry out that the person who wore them was made in the glory of God, a human being made to be glory-bearing, glory-reflecting, glory-bound. You are the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Where will you encounter it today? Where will you see God shining in the faces around you? And how will you shine? I asked someone this morning, where are you? They asked, what are you preaching on this morning? And I said, well, I'm preaching on the glory of God. And they went, what? I said, where do you see the glory of God shining? And right away they said, oh, my grandchildren. Like, I'm with you, pal. My wife. And then they described a couple of their friends. How will you shine? And where will you see the glory? May it be so for us today.